Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Abby Stansfield, and I'm a public programmer here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center. And it is my pleasure to be able to welcome you to tonight's launch of the 2022 General, the undergraduate history journal published by the Brock University History Society, Historical Society. We are pleased to partner with Brock University History Department to highlight the great work that their students and faculty are doing by hosting this event both live here at the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center and via live stream. The St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center and Brock University acknowledges the land that we are gathered on is traditional tree of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish and One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of the Indigenous peoples. Because of this hybrid event, we recognize that many people might be joining us from different territories. So we encourage you to reflect on the territory that you are joining us from and reflect on what the land acknowledgement means to you personally. Tonight is the museum's second time hosting the General Lodge, the first time being in 2021 on our virtual museum lecture series on YouTube. I'm personally very excited for this evening's event and the opportunity to hear the students who have submitted articles to the 2022 edition of the General. One thing that is apparent when you work here is that our community is always eager to learn. We are thrilled to host this symposium and facilitate that exchange. Tonight's speakers represent our local up-and-coming historians and speaking on local, Canadian, and international history. For those who find themselves inspired after tonight's speakers to revisit last year's event or rewatch tonight's proceedings, you are in luck. Both are available on the St. Catharines Museum YouTube channel, along with the museum's past virtual museum lecture series. For those eagerly anticipating new lectures for the series, the next lecture is tomorrow at 7 p.m. and features Carl Dockstetter presenting In Friendship, the history of friendship centers and truth and reconciliation. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. At this time, I am pleased to welcome and turn it over to the co-editors of this year's edition of the General, Mariah Pellier and Alexander Lewis.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Abby. On behalf of Alex and I, the Brock University Historical Society, and the Brock University Department of History, we would like to extend our gratitude and thanks to the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center for opening up their space to us tonight and hosting this wonderful event. A special thank you also to Adrian Petrie for his enthusiasm towards the planning and preparation of this event.
We are very excited to celebrate the hard work of many of the undergraduate history students and those involved in creating Volume 7 of the General, the Brock University Undergraduate Journal of History. Tonight, you will hear from many of these students about their experiences throughout the process of becoming published authors. But first, we would like to welcome Dr. Tammy Friedman virtually. She is an associate professor with the Department of History and the author of this year's Foreword, to say a few words about the struggles that students and faculty faced this year and the challenges that they were able to overcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but I didn't want to risk getting anybody sick. It's just a cold, I think. I wanted to, first of all, thank the co-editors for asking me to write the foreword for this academic year's issue of the General. I was honored by that. I was a little bit daunted because the list of things that I was sent that I might cover was pretty long. But actually, it was a great way for me to help me reflect on what I thought would be some of the most useful ways to think about links between the conditions that we've been facing in the last year and the study of the past, and how that's reflected in what the editors and their faculty advisor and the students whose work appears in the General have been able to produce. So the foreword gave me a chance to reflect on this past year in really two different ways. First, I wanted to think about the challenges and opportunities that have been involved in our efforts to navigate the pandemic as members of the Brock University community. And second, I wanted to think about some of the big historical developments that we're living through right now and what they can teach us about how to use our skills as students and scholars of the past in order to make sense of the present. So first, just to say a little bit about challenges and opportunities, lots of challenges, of course, in the past year, as well as in the previous one. New forms of interaction in both within and outside of the classroom that we've had to engage in, new ways of doing our work, of meeting in class, of doing research, and the need to communicate with each other in new ways, not just virtually instead of stopping into a professor's office, but also, I think, needing to be more open in some ways and communicating with each other about challenges that we face and trying to do our work. Students needing to trust faculty members perhaps more than in the past with some things that aren't strictly about what happens in school. For example, the foreword gave me a chance to think about some of the things we're missing, like casual conversations in the hallway, and some of the things that we've gained. And I think having to be more upfront with each other about our own circumstances and how those affect the work that we do and the way that we do it. I think that's been important to recognize more clearly the ways in which we don't always have control over the circumstances in which we're operating. And that, I think, is a big takeaway for historians who are also living through pretty significant historical developments, that we are shaped very much by the larger circumstances around us, and that we don't always get to make choices as we might think we do. That's something I think the pandemic really has taught us in the last year about our own work and study, and also something that we can carry into our understanding of the big events of today. And that leads me to this question that I also wanted to grapple with in the foreword, and that is, how do we use the tools of historians that we apply to making sense of the past in order to make sense of the present? And so I wanted to consider a couple of big issues that I think really apply to big historical circumstances that we have been dealing with. One, of course, the pandemic, and the other, the Russian war in Ukraine. And I just want to highlight a couple of points that I wanted to explore in the foreword. First, the reminder that great men, high-ranking politicians, military figures, et cetera, are not the only people who make history, but that there are lots of ordinary people who do extraordinary things and who influence policy, who help to shape it, whose responses to it help to carve out new paths. I think we've seen that in the pandemic, how lots of historical actors who aren't simply public health leaders or national political figures have been shaping the discourse and debate around the pandemic and how to respond to it. And I think we've also seen it in the case of the war in Ukraine, where it's not just the key political leaders whose words and deeds we're paying close attention to, but also lots of other ordinary people, international observers, protesters within Russia, for example, and others who are influencing what's taking place. In addition to thinking about how multiple historical actors shape or make really the history that we're living in, something that we also know from our study of the past, I also wanted to reflect a little bit on the role of the media in an era when really anybody can claim to be reporting news, who has access to social media, and the need to apply the skills that we use to look at primary sources in the past, and particularly media sources, and use that same critical approach, thinking about point of view, thinking about perspective, thinking about bias, in order to make sure that our understanding of what's happening today recognizes the complexity of really the primary sources that are being presented to us right now. All of this, I think, has influenced the papers that are represented in this issue of the General, how you as students approach your research over the past year, how you gathered your sources, the limitations and maybe some new opportunities there, how you fashioned your arguments, marshaled evidence to support them, and how you produced your written work. This to me is a major accomplishment that really links together your knowledge of the past and your experience in the present. And I think you should all be extremely proud of what you've achieved in a really daunting and dramatic period in our lives. So thanks again for inviting me to participate in this. And I'm very excited to hear you talk about the work that you created. Thanks.
Words. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to write this year's foreword and being here tonight to celebrate this special event with us. Now, a little bit more about our experience as editors. To say that we were a little bit clueless at the beginning of the term is kind of an understatement. We didn't have any knowledge of publishing or even the password to the General's email. We quickly started learning that the ins and outs of the open journal system using modules, playing around with the system and consulting Tim Ribrick, the digital services librarian, and we would like to thank him for his assistance and guidance, which made the online system a little less daunting as first-time editors. We then put out a call for essays in the hopes of getting a few submissions, but we were pleasantly surprised that we were receiving so many amazing submissions, which then made the decision process a little bit more difficult than we had originally thought. But once we chose the essays, we quickly moved on to the peer review stage and hosted a peer reviewer session where we got to reconnect, or in a few cases, meet our amazing peer reviewers who took time out of their busy schedules and their reading week to provide feedback and comments on the essays that they were assigned. Without the patience, hard work, and flexibility of these peer reviewers, we would not have been able to publish so many great essays. So we extend a special thanks to these peer reviewers: Daniel Chabani, Ty Doma, Haley Drury, Bram Fuchs, Yannick Rion, Paige Groot, Michael Horvath, Caitlin Jonescu, Kirsten Koop, Ben Morrison, Nicholas Roden, and Ashley Risdick. After the authors received the peer reviewers' feedback and completed their revisions, we had to make the difficult decision of choosing the essays that would be accepted to be published in this year's edition. Then it was time for the copy editing stage, where we spent multiple Saturdays on the Brock campus editing and finalizing the essays. We formalized footnotes, checked the citations, got clarification from authors when needed, and formatted the files. And thanks to many cups of coffee and McFlurries, we got through these fabulous essays and our own coursework on top of that, to end with a final product that we are extremely proud of, and we hope the authors and peer reviewers are as well. We can confidently say that we learned a lot about the publication and the editorial process throughout the term, and we have a greater appreciation for the behind the scenes work that is involved in publishing journals and books.
Along with this year's edition of the General being available online, it was also printed for the first time in 3 years because of COVID-19. The printing process was also new to Alex and I, and we found it challenging at times, but are grateful for the assistance of Paul Tritton and the Brock University Printing and Digital Services team for printing this year's edition and having the copies available for the launch, even given the tight timeline and busy exam season. Overall, this was a very special project for us to take on together, and we are grateful to our supervisor, Dr. Danny Sampson, Associate Professor with the Department of History, for his guidance and support throughout this process. Alex and I have experienced many challenges throughout this term and had to make tough decisions that we weren't necessarily expecting to have to make while being co-editors. We are grateful to have had Professor Sampson there supporting us along the way and as we navigated through this unpredictable school year. The General represents the work of so many undergraduate history students. The authors are students, the peer reviewers are students, the cover design artist is a student, and we, the editors, are also students. Tonight, as we celebrate this milestone, we will be inviting some of the authors to share a bit about their essays, along with revealing the cover design for this year's edition towards the end of the event. To start us off, we would like to invite Bram Fuchs, virtually, a third-year honors history student, to say a few words about his essay titled Canadian Veteran Headstones and What They Can Tell Us.
Hi, yeah, it's great to be here. I honestly didn't expect to be included in this edition of the General, just because my paper was written for a classics course rather than a history course. So a huge part of this was editing it down into a history journal format, which was really interesting to me. I had a great time, and my paper I think was pretty unique, and that I had to go gather data in the field. It was really new to me. I had a great time, and I'm glad that I can show it off here.
Some of the other variables that you would expand on.
Sorry, I missed the first part of that. Could you repeat it?
Abby? Okay, go ahead.
You have to read it.
Oh, sorry. So the questions were, what are some challenges that you faced while collecting this data on your own? And if you were to do this study again, what are some of the other variables that you would expand upon?
Yeah, so in terms of challenges, it was really interesting to me to actually go out into the field and gather this data. Usually with history papers, all the information that you're going to be synthesizing is at your fingertips or in the library. In this case, I just had to walk, I had to actually go out and walk 5 kilometers to the Victoria Lawn Cemetery and then crisscross the whole thing, ensuring I was getting samples from every site, which was my plan. And then in terms of gathering the data myself, ensuring randomness was really interesting. We were really given no guidelines besides gather data and write a paper on it, which was great. It was really freeing, but it meant that ensuring randomness was kind of something I really had to pay attention to, because it was really all on me to gather all this data. Even even the fact that these headstones had to be legible so that I could record the data off of them probably led to some sort of bias toward newer headstones. In terms of if I were to do the study again, what variables I would expand, I think I'd probably narrow the focus to a couple of variables. I thought that the interplay between the age at death on these headstones and the actions seen in terms of if these people had served in a war was quite interesting. I found veterans died a little younger on average than the average person, but that was incredibly pronounced among World War I veterans. I think I'd love to write a paper about specifically World War I veterans in Canada and why they seem to, at least from this paper, die so much younger than the general population, even after coming home safe from the war.
Sorry, thank you, Bram. We really appreciate your input. We would now like to invite Daniel Chibani, a fourth-year honors history student, to tell more about his essay titled "The Facade of Moral Superiority: Great Britain's Ulterior Motives in Abolishing Ottoman Slavery."
I wasn't sure if I should just come up right away or after you're talking. Sorry about that.
Perfect.
Yeah, I prepared like a little something, so I'll just kind of talk about my essay a little bit. So in my essay, I'm actually arguing that the British Empire had vast economic, political, and territorial interests in abolishing Ottoman slavery. So I'm looking at the mostly in the 20th century and the 19th century and the early 20th century, before the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, for lack of a better term. But pretty much in my essay, I'm just kind of I'm looking at how the British implemented this abolitionist policy into the Ottoman Empire and why they did it. So one of the reasons why I picked this topic in the first place was because I do have a bit of an interest in British history. So that was, first of all, like the number one thing I wanted to look at. And I wrote this essay in a course with Professor Benaz Mirzai. So I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. That was the first thing. It was a bit difficult, especially finding primary sources. That was definitely the most difficult part about my essay, because there was a lot of historians that talk about Middle Eastern slavery. Yet at the same time, I found it difficult to find primary sources in English. A lot of the sources that I was dealing with were in Arabic, and I don't know Arabic. So my dad does, though. So I actually had him help me quite a bit in some areas. So I had to get him to translate a few things for me, which is nice. But yeah, that was definitely like a challenge that I had when I was writing my essay, was just finding sources, primary sources from the period. Yeah, and yeah, I think, okay, well, I think my essay I think it's important to look at this because I'm kind of arguing for that the British Empire has almost like a moral facade of emancipation. So on the surface, they really do seem like they're abolishing Ottoman slavery for moral reasons. Yet what I found is that all of these moral reasons led to other kind of reasons. So, for example, economic reasons. The British Empire decided to, for example, go into like the Red Sea and the Middle East kind of area, citing slavery and abolishing slavery from its root, for example, in even East Africa. One of the reasons why they went into East Africa was to destroy the sources of slavery for the Ottoman Empire. So I looked at that and I said, yeah, well, there's definitely something to look at here. We should definitely discuss this. And Middle Eastern slavery, although it's discussed, there's not a lot of looking at the British Empire and what kind of motivations they had to, first of all, to go into the Middle East and and to attempt to abolish slavery. So that's what I wanted to look at in my essay, and I think it was okay. So yeah, that's pretty much like everything I'm looking at. It would be great. Everyone should read it, and everyone should read every essay. But I'm also doing an MA in my own essay, so I'm so happy about that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the future, and I really like to thank Mariah and Alexandra for accepting my essay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have a couple questions for Daniel, just to expand upon his essay a bit more. Why do you think that Britain's ulterior motives are often not discussed, and how did you examine these through your research specifically?
Okay. So yeah, I don't think that their ulterior motives are discussed very much, because the British, they had a global emancipation effort. So they were trying to abolish slavery all over the world at this point. And they were actually one of the first European nations and even empires to abolish slavery. So I think on the surface, it definitely looks like they were kind of emancipators. But at the same time, there is something there, like I was saying, and that's why I wrote my essay on this, because the British definitely did have a lot of economic and political interests in actually going into the Middle East and attempting to abolish slavery. So yeah, I think that's the main reason for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We would now ask Sarah Kavanagh, a third-year honors history student and Canadian studies student, to come up and discuss her essay, The Invasion of the Yellow Race, an Anti-Asian Discourse in Early 20th Century Niagara.
Hi. No, I don't look like a student, but I assure you I am. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about my essay that's based on this editorial here. So my essay looks at anti-Asian sentiment in early 20th century Niagara, primarily through media discourse, institutional regulation, and activities relating to Chinese restaurants. While researching another paper last year, I came upon this 1918 editorial from the Grimsby Independent, and I was struck by its provocative headline, which, as you can see, uses strong racialized language. Its equally strident content urges citizens and town council to fight the opening of a Chinese restaurant on Main Street in Grimsby. The editorial incites moral panic about the unseemly influence a Chinese restaurant would have on the town, suggesting it would threaten the moral fiber of its citizens. I put the editorial aside, hoping to have the chance to use it down the road. Last semester, I took a second-year Canadian Studies course on Canada's cultural communities and seized the opportunity to use it for a paper about the Chinese experience in Niagara. As shocking as the editorial is, in my essay, I argue that such inflammatory discourse was not unusual in this period. The editorial reflects the Victorian-era ideologies about race and gender, which positioned British white Anglo-Saxon Protestants as superior and relegated Asians to the lower ranks of racial hierarchies. Females were viewed as delicate and in need of protection. Chinese restaurants were considered, quote, dens of iniquity, and there were widespread fears about women and girls being lured into prostitution and so-called white slavery through drug use and opium smoking. Chinese entrepreneurship was also hampered by government measures, including the $500 federal head tax on Chinese immigrants, equal to the annual income of an assistant cook in a Chinese restaurant. Provinces also introduced legislation which banned white women from working in Chinese restaurants. At the local level, authorities heightened surveillance and regulation of Chinese businesses through frequent health inspections, police raids, and bylaws which regulated how many Chinese restaurants could open in a town and where and when they could operate. Despite prevailing negative stereotypes and institutional barriers, Chinese restaurants in Niagara continued to become public spaces for cultural interaction. They gave Chinese immigrants an opportunity to demonstrate their willingness to assimilate into Canadian culture. They learned the English language to deal with customers, offered Western cuisine on their menus, and frequently gave their restaurants Canadian names, such as the Maple Leaf Cafe and the Toronto Cafe in St. Catharines, and the Dominion Cafe in Grimsby. Many Chinese immigrants embraced Western religions and belonged to local Presbyterian and Methodist churches. Indeed, in a letter to the editor of the Standard, the minister at Knox Presbyterian Church praised their Christian character, saying, quote, "Their respect for the house of God is an example to many of our Canadian youths." My essay research focused on media discourse, so I spent a lot of time going through local newspapers to get a sense of community attitudes and how Chinese restaurants functioned as public spaces in what appeared to be a hostile racial environment. Chinese voices were largely unheard. On a couple of occasions, a Chinese restaurant owner was quoted in the newspaper, but even then, his accent was exaggerated and mocked. I also spent time going through business directories and census documents, examining original digitized enumeration sheets through the Library and Archives Canada database to get a sense of the ages, places of residence, occupations, and incomes of Niagara's Chinese community. Most were cooks, hand laundry workers, and grocers. Some were factory laborers and domestics. One was a houseboy on the Leonard estate here in St. Catharines. I'd never worked with original census documents before, and it was challenging deciphering the handwriting and making judgments about the accuracy of the information that was recorded, since it largely depended on the skill and detail of the enumerator. One imagines there were language barriers as well. Many times I found handwritten information crossed off and replaced, sometimes in key categories with critical distinctions, such as whether an immigrant was a naturalized Canadian. I enjoy working with primary sources because they let me be part archaeologist, part detective, looking for information and piecing together bits of a 100-year-old narrative. There are many twists and turns in the complex treatment that Chinese immigrants received here in Niagara. To illustrate, a 1915 issue of the Grimsby Independent contained an advertisement celebrating the opening of a Chinese laundry in the Livingston block, so named for the Livingston family, the longtime publishers and owners of the Grimsby Independent. 2 years later, this same newspaper would write disparagingly about the Chinese race in this provocative editorial that is central to my essay. Despite racial discrimination, it seems Chinese immigrants in Grimsby were able to foster positive business relationships, even sharing space with their most vocal critics. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
So thank you, Sarah. What was the most challenging part of using newspapers as your main source of information for your essay? And what surprised you the most throughout your research?
Well, I love newspapers, and they're so rich in content, and there's so much, especially in that era, there's so much subjectivity in the reporting, even just like straight news reports, not aside from editorials, just news reporting. Often it has a lot of the reporter's personality injected into it and opinions. But I use newspapers primarily in two formats. There were digitized copies of the Grimsby Independent they're available on the ontario.ca database. And that's wonderful because you can do keyword searches. You have to really be in tune with the vocabulary of the period because you can't limit it to just saying Chinese because people didn't refer to them in the newspapers as Chinese. So you have to use Celestials and Orientals. And so you have to really have some context and understanding of the period. Sometimes the digital copies would be obscured, like parts of the newspaper would be obscured or missing. So, you know, you're kind of get through halfway through a story and then you're missing the end of it. So that was the problem with digital. I also spent a lot of Friday afternoons with Edie in the Brock Archives, going through microfiche after microfiche at the St. Catharines Standard, because that is not available on the ontario.ca database. So microfiche has its challenges because you can't do a keyword search. So you have to scroll through and go up and down through every single page of every issue. And I was specifically going through the St. Catharines Standard looking for something that is referred to in this editorial. They refer to an incident that happened in downtown St. Catharines, and we don't want this to happen in Grimsby. So I was so curious, what are they talking about? So I had to go back I started back, I think in February, and then went through all the February St. Catharines Standards, all the March ones until Yahoo, I found it. And it was like, oh, gold mine, I came home, I was so excited. And which leads into your second question, really, because what was the most surprising thing was that there was this like mini race riot here in St. Catharines the week before this editorial was published, which I think is what inspired the editor to write this. So these two teenage girls were walking downtown St. Catharines on Sunday evening, and they felt like a young Chinese man was following them. And so they ran into the NS&T office and they called the police, and they said, this man's following us. Well, it was a man, I think he was 18. And so that created this whole stir because the police came, but the girl said, oh, he wasn't really like physically assaulting us. So they let him go. So all these, St. Catharines youth came up, and they started this little mob, and they started roaming the streets of St. Catharines looking for Chinese citizens, and 3 of them were assaulted. So a 16-year-old St. Catharines boy was arrested. And anyway, it was a series that played out over a whole week. And there were multiple letters to the editor, and all sorts of, surprises. And then it ended at the end of the week with the consul general from Ottawa, the Chinese consul general from Ottawa, having to come down to St. Catharines, meet with the mayor, meet with the Chinese community here, which was quite small. And they sent away the Chinese teenager who had followed these girls in chains. So anyway, it was kind of interesting because it sort of demonstrates too that so many immigrants were supposed to be expected to be passive and just accept treatment, and they were always the guilty party, and they were just sent away, even though the girls at the trial said all he had done was follow them. He hadn't done anything. It was just for 2 blocks. So I think they just said, I think he wanted to get us to know us, and he would wave to us. So anyway, that was the most surprising thing I found. You're welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. We would now like to invite Kirsten Koop, a third-year honors history student, to tell you more about her essay titled "A Vicious Victim: The Physical and Spiritual Realms of Early Christianity and Martyrdom."
Good evening. My paper is actually called "A Victorious Victim: The Physical and Spiritual Realms of Early Christianity and Martyrdom." And it is framed around the idea of exploring the tensions between the physical and the spiritual realms as the early Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries would have experienced them. So the paper mainly focuses on the story of Saint Perpetua, who was a young woman living in Carthage at the turn of the 3rd century. She was a young mother, a wife, a sister, and a daughter, and she was also a Christian. So at this time, being a Christian in the Roman Empire was extremely dangerous, as the Roman authorities had not at this point converted to Christianity and frequently persecuted the Christians. So Perpetua was imprisoned with a group of Christians, and together they refused to make sacrifices to the Roman gods. For this, she and the rest of the group were sentenced to death by wild animals in a Roman amphitheater. And this event was held actually as a birthday celebration for one of the Roman leaders. So the main source that I analyzed for my paper was a document that recorded the story of Perpetua. And it is written from her perspective. It's in the first person, although it's an ongoing debate about whether or not she actually wrote the document. So the document itself mainly focuses on the context for Perpetua's life, but also explores 4 visions that she experienced while she was in prison. When I began to read this document, one of the things that stood out to me was that there were a number of very familiar and physical objects that were found in this very spiritual sort of vision. And as I continued to read, I realized that not only was this true, but this very spiritual vision held real-world implications for the early Christians during this time period. So for example, in one of the visions, Perpetua is climbing a ladder, and this ladder is lined with sharp objects and weapons, making it very dangerous and difficult to climb. But she continues, and once she reaches the top, she is greeted by a shepherd who then offers her some milk. So initially, some of the things that stood out to me were these, again, very familiar objects of the ladder, the weapons, and the milk. But it held a deeper spiritual significance for these early Christians. They interpreted the vision to mean that early Christians in their, or that the group of the Christians during this time period would experience pain and suffering while they were on earth, but if they continued to pursue their faith, then they would eventually achieve a spiritual reward. So I found that for the early Christians, the spiritual and the temporal realms were not two distinct entities. Rather, they blended together and overlapped in order to create a more comprehensive idea of what the early Christian identity looked like. So for example, you couldn't take someone like Perpetua and distinguish or categorize her spiritual motivations and actions from the physical ones. They were two things blended together. So Perpetua's life at this time gives us a window into what life would have looked like for an early Christian living under persecution and how they viewed the physical and the spiritual realms. At the end of my paper, I touch briefly on this, but I think that one of the questions I have moving forward is how this principle of living in the physical, but for the spiritual, was applied following this period of persecution with the emergence of Christendom and the power of the church.
Thank you, Kirsten. Two of the published authors were not able to join us tonight. Haley Drury is a fourth-year concurrent education honors history student whose paper is titled Wedding Bells and Colonial Hells, Indigenous Settler Intermarriage in Colonial North America. From her abstract, Drury notes, this essay examines the practice of Indigenous settler intermarriage during the colonial period of North America. While historians know that intermarriage was an economic strategy used by both settler men and North American Native women during the fur trade era, inaccuracies in parish records fail to demonstrate how prevalent the practice really was in this region. This paper thus presents an examination of what reasons both sides of the dynamic had for practicing interracial marriage and what benefits they derived from its execution. Indeed, the first half of the essay aims to analyze the psychological, economic, and imperialistic benefits Indigenous women, settler men, and related stakeholders enjoyed as a result of intermarriage, using examples from both colonial Canada and America. The second half looks at what drawbacks resulted from intermarriage, emphasizing that these drawbacks were mainly isolated to the later years of colonization, when European influence and power had spread throughout the continent. The legacy of Indigenous settler intermarriage and the devastation of colonialization persists still today, which is why this topic is a worthy addition to the historical discourse.
Next, we have Matthew Boats, a fourth-year concurrent education honors history student who wrote an essay titled Unfortunate Souls, the People in the Thralls of Mayo's Cultural Revolution. From his abstract, Boyd highlights that this research examines the impacts, implications, and consequences that Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 had on various social groups and classes of people throughout China. The effects of the revolution were seen throughout the separation of families, educational impacts on children, increased government intervention on farming, and the changing political atmosphere experienced during this revolution. By analyzing individual stories, experiences, and impacts of the disastrous Cultural Revolution, this paper aims to provide a humanizing aspect and thus convey how deeply people suffered, the millions of lives lost, and the depth of the scar left on 20th century Chinese society, culture, and values by communist leadership. We would now like to invite Yannick Ringon, a fourth-year honors history student, to discuss his essay, The Acadian Expulsion of 1755 as an Expression of British Imperial Interests.
Yes, hello. Most of my notes I took here kind of about the process, the thoughts I had, kind of what I learned while writing the essay and researching it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So this was written for a fourth-year class, which means that the direction for it was basically write an essay. So I thought about the Great Deportation, the expulsion of the Acadians, and talked to Professor Sampson to kind of formulate the question, and came up with what I thought was ultimately, a simple question, which was just, why did it happen? Why were the Acadians expelled in 1755 by the British? And it sounded simple enough. It kind of wasn't, but we'll get into that. I thought the research I did on it, I thought was really interesting. I learned a lot. I've got stacks of highlighted notes still on my shelf that I took, while sitting at my kitchen table, just with a pile of books, reading them, go through the notes. I also read some earlier historians from the late 19th century, the early 20th century, which was a really interesting perspective when people were a lot more biased. There was a lot kind of less question about academic objectivity. So that was interesting, as much for a lesson of what not to do as a history writer as for their value as a source themselves. I also found huge value in being able to read French, because we're talking about Acadia and a lot of writers about it and a lot of the sources are in French, and that was a real value while I was working on this. So throw back to for elementary school and French immersion, that pays off in the end. So as I was kind of working on answering my main question, why did the Great Expulsion happen? I came across a lot of different answers, essentially. Was it the Acadians refusing to swear loyalty to the British Empire? Was it, just another example of the British kicking out a native population like they did in Ireland and Scotland? Was it entirely the responsibility of the individuals who kind of led the charge on the expulsion itself? Was it purely an economic thing? Was it a religious thing? To replace the Catholic Acadians with Protestant settlers? And as I completed my read everything, it kind of sank in that it was all of those things, that it was the British Empire kind of enacting all of those factors at once. So this simple question did not really have a simple answer. And so overall, I think kind of the biggest thing that I learned from it, what I took away from it, was I found it really valuable to look at this one event in history with one kind of focused, specific question, and see just how many events played into it, just how many factors affected it. That it doesn't just stand on its own. Nothing in history is its own event. There's always lots going on. There's always many causes for everything.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yannick. Just a couple questions we had for you. Do you think Acadians were able to maintain neutrality during the ongoing French and British conflicts well, given the circumstances? And what do you think is the lasting overall effect of the 1755 expulsion?
Yeah, it's good questions. Yes, I think the Acadians absolutely were able to maintain neutrality, and that was kind of a big problem for them, was they were so insistent on maintaining their neutrality and refusing to sign on with the British or with the French even, that was definitely a factor in getting them expelled from their homeland, essentially. As for the impact of it, that's a little bit harder to determine. It's the opposite end of what my essay focused on, but it was. I think the Acadians definitely we see the kind of culture shift. They settled in Louisiana, they settled in France, and there's a real legacy to it. There are still Acadian people in Nova Scotia, in the Maritimes, who really do cleave quite strongly to these historical ties. There's an Acadian flag and a real culture to it. So even though it really did disperse them and cause a lot of harm to this community, they are still strong and they're still there. And ultimately, the Grand Détachement, it failed ultimately.
Thank you, Yannick. Next, to discuss your essay titled Comparing Penitential Acts, Why the Flagellants of 1349 Were Condemned While Those in 1260 Were Not, is Amy Lowe, a fourth-year honors history student.
I'm also kind of talking more about the process with my essay. But my essay focuses on two groups of flagellants. For context, flagellation, it was a prominent practice in the church of serving penance. One would strip down from the waist up and whip themselves until they bled. Two groups that became very widespread for this. One was in the year 1260 in sort of in the Italy area. The other one that I focused on that was actually my original focus was in 1349 during the Black Death. Going into the essay, I didn't really have a, going into my research, I didn't really have a question that I wanted to answer. I just knew I wanted to talk about the Black Plague. And I started my research from a small part of a chronicle by Jean de Venette, who was a French clergyman and chronicler, lived during that time, during the Black Death. And he very briefly mentioned this group of flagellants and the fact that they were condemned by the church rather quickly. I think it took about 2 months for them to be completely condemned and banned from practicing. And the main thing that kind of shocked me looking at Jean de Venette was that he mentions this very, very briefly. He kind of didn't give any reason as to why, so I wanted to look into that. Then becomes the biggest difficulty in my essay, which was finding sources. There are not a lot of sources in the English language on the flagellants in that time. During my research, though, that was when I discovered the flagellant party of 1260, and who were actually given religious legitimacy by the church. This kind of took my essay in a whole other direction of why they were treated so differently, which is a conclusion I came to of largely behavior. The ones in the 1349 group seem to show a lot more greed. They were charging people who wanted to join them money, a lot of stuff like that. However, one of the bigger issues that I found during that was I relied on a lot of primary sources for my the part of my essay on the group of flagellants during the Black Death. And however, all three of these primary sources were from people who were within the clergy, which causes a potential bias in the research because they are all coming from the same place, same time period. In fact, one of my other sources, Jean de Fate, was likely a contemporary and possibly even knew Jean de Venette. They're both from France. I believe they both spent time in Paris. And sorry. Another thing, they did have a lot of similarities. For example, they were both created in response to some sort of strife or suffering. Of course, in 1349, that was the Black Death. They originated believing that if they did this penance, it would get rid of it. And in 1260, it was in response to the conflicts between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. I didn't go very far into the history of that into my essay, wasn't the main point. Sorry, once again. I think that's pretty much it. I won't answer questions.
Thank you, Amy. You kind of touched on my first question, so I'm going to skip that. But were you expecting to find prominent key differences between the two groups going into your research, or what were you kind of expecting?
I was expecting to find differences. I honestly wasn't entirely sure what I was going to find at all. As I said, that wasn't my original direction when it came to my research. However, I think it is an important question, and it really looks into the context of things and but again, I think the main kind of focus that my essay turned into was looking into the bias of the situation, because it's not exactly possible to get a direct answer. And I think it would be nice to see more research on the subject, especially in the English language, because a lot of it was in German and I don't speak that.
Thank you.
Now we invite Ben Morrison, a third-year concurrent education honors history student, to discuss his paper, Murder, Greed, and Corrupt Politicians, the Fall of the Roman Republic.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hello, my grandparents back home online. I just want to say thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that. I'm excited to be here tonight as opposed to our online meeting last year. As Alex and Mariah had said about my essay, it's all about the inevitability of the fall of the Roman Republic. So for those who are unfamiliar with the topic, we are talking about the Republic founded in 509 BC that ended around 27 BC, but that's still sort of up for debate. The argument of my essay is that the inevitability of the fall of Rome. Sorry, the essay argues that the fall of the Roman Republic was inevitable. So it means that no matter what, I think eventually the Roman Republic would have come to an end. Many different reasons for this that I touch on in the introduction of my essay, but the main one that I chose to focus on in the actual writing was political leadership instead of political policy and foreign affairs. So I focus on some of the politicians in Rome's demise instead of different aspects of that. So in my essay, I argue that the deaths of the Gracchi brothers introduced Rome to political violence that would never disappear. I also argue that Lucius Sulla led an army that was loyal to himself rather than to the Roman Republic. And lastly, I argue that Caesar was the true end of the Roman Republic because he proved that a single man could have more power than the entire Republic. As for sources that I use mostly sources from a course textbook in my History of the Roman Republic course that I took with my buddy Ethan in the front row here in the fall last year. So it was a great collection. It was with Professor Reeves, if you guys have had him. He's awesome, by the way. So the textbook was by Dillon and Garland and was a collection of primary sources from the early Republic all the way to the death of Augustus Caesar. So I know I'm like, oh, I only use one textbook, but it was like a million sources front to back. It took me forever to read all these different things. Yeah, so that was the main support of my argument there. And something that I found interesting was the lack of secondary sources in my essay. So you get a little bit more fact and less author opinion from someone who's read something and given their own thoughts to it. So during this Republic course that I took last fall, they had about 20 prompts to choose for our final essay. So I thought the inevitability of the fall of Rome gave me a little more room to play with as one of the more broad topics. So I could kind of like write about what I wanted to write about instead of doing something a little more specific. It was definitely something that could be argued, what I argue. So I like to like have the challenge of writing an argumentative essay that people could say, hey, that's wrong. And I get to like prove my point. I think the biggest struggle that I encountered while writing my essay was deciding what I wanted to include. Like I said, it was a pretty broad topic. So in reality, there are dozens of factors that caused the Roman Republic to fall. I had to try and narrow down my argument. So first I picked a reason why the Republic ended, which mine was political instability. And then I had to choose how to examine this. So I went through the route of crooked politicians and how they kind of led to the demise of the Republic. And then lastly, I had to pick specific examples to like argue my point. So I chose the Gracchi brothers, Sulla and Caesar, who are some pretty big names. I don't know if you guys have heard of the first couple, but everyone knows Julius Caesar. And then lastly, I think that it's important to remember this essay because there's a lot of parallels between ancient Rome and today. For example, we're seeing more and more populist leaders emerge who are being elected on false promises more than the average person. Not to get too political, but even within my lifetime, we can see politicians campaigning with the intentions of pleasing the people just to get elected. I'll give you a quote you've probably heard before. Winston Churchill said that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So I think it's important to keep in mind when discussing ancient Rome. Anyway, that is about all I have for today. I think you guys should give the paper a read, even if you're new to the subject. I think it's easy enough to follow along. So thank you all for your time today, coming out and support me and all these other amazing authors here. Have a great night.
Thank you, Ben. So one question I had for you was if you could just elaborate more on what your experience working with these primary sources from this era.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. It was really cool to work with primary sources from this era. Like I said, I faced the problem that some of them were not in English right away, so things to be like transcribed. But it's like interesting to see people write about things that happened back then that are obviously not commonplace today, like the assassination of Caesar and like huge wars and people dying all the time. And so it's just like different content than you get in like a primary source today that might be a newspaper. So it's something that I had to sift through and also determine like a lot of the sources that people use about Caesar are written by Caesar. So there's this like, hey, I'm actually a lot better than I am in a lot of his work. So that's something you have to look for sure. But I thought it was really interesting to get to pick up on all these other primary sources.
And that's all I got.
Thank you, Ben. Now we would like to welcome Evan Pelchete, a third-year concurrent education honors history student, to just discuss this paper, A Close Examination of Edward Fry and his report on British parliamentary proceedings pertaining to the Opium Wars and subsequent government policies.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to the Brock University Historical Society and the St. Catharines Museum and Wellington Canal Center for putting this on. I know it's a busy time with exams and it's nice to take a break and to see everyone. And thank you again for everyone coming and everyone attending virtually. As the title suggests, my paper mainly focuses on Edward Fry, who was the first Quaker judge in England, and he he consistently advocated for the outlaw of the opium trade with China, and also he criticized the British Empire's involvement in the wars and also enforcing the trade onto China. He felt that it was morally in right of Britain to do it. He felt that they should apologize for enforcing the illegal trade onto them. And so my paper mainly focuses on how, despite his criticism, that he still supported the British imperial endeavors. He just disagreed with the methods. He would rather, instead of violence, he'd rather more peaceful operations of economic dominance. And also a big issue for him was that he felt the opium trade impacted the perception of British citizens within China. And he felt that if the opium trade went away, that more people would be able to convert to Christianity. And so I think the big thing with this paper, and one of the things that really stuck out to me, was that it was not just how or what people did, but in the method they did it in. It wasn't just that, Britain was in control or in economic dominance, but it was how they did it. And so it shows just how you speak is just as important as what you say. And so that is really what interested me with my paper.
Thank you, Evan. So just two quick questions. How do you think Edward Fry's religious beliefs as a Quaker come across in the proceedings you examined? And what challenges did you face through researching for this paper?
So throughout his report, he doesn't draw on overtly religious symbols related to Quakerism. He really establishes very methodically of, the violence is bad, so we should not do this. And so I think that was also one of the challenges with analyzing this document, is that it wasn't outright religious tones. So I found that aspect challenging. Another aspect was that it was written 15, 16 years after the fact. And so there was not a lot of research necessarily done, in the aftermath of the Opium Wars. And I think that was hard to find sources in that sense. And also his opinion on the Opium Wars was very much in the minority. A lot of people still supported it. So to find other sources that, advocated for the abolition of the trade was also difficult.
Thank you so much, Evan. Now we would like to invite our cover artist, Elizabeth Boudreau, a third-year concurrent education honors history student, to discuss her vision for the cover art before revealing this year's design.
Hello, so I'm Elizabeth, and I'm so honored to be here and to have been able to design the cover for this year's edition of The General. So I just want to take this time to sort of talk about my design and the meaning behind it, which you'll see in a few minutes. So I kind of wanted, when I was coming up with the design, I wanted to make something that would represent what this year has sort of encompassed for Brock students. Last year, with our transition online, everything felt rather disconnected. There was sort of like this shroud of uncertainty and fear, as no one really knew what the future would hold. So when Brock announced the reopening of campus, it felt like there was this light at the end of a dark tunnel. So I wanted my design to represent that shift from last year back to campus this year. So as you'll see in a minute, there is a door on the design that is opening. I wanted it to look like it was opening to a brighter future and sort of this hope. So I chose a lot of bright colors to the inside of the door. As for the outside of the door, it's very dark because it sort of represents us going from this dark year in 2020 to this sort of hopeful future where perhaps we can continue to re-enter student life and the Brock community. So with that being said, I really hope you all enjoyed the design, and thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And if we can go to the next slide, you'll see on the screen, yes. So as you see on the screen, her design captures this school year and the last school year, as she discussed so beautifully. And we really appreciate you being here with us tonight, Elizabeth, and talking about the design. And we also got it printed this year, so it's there too. We would now like to invite our supervisor, Dr. Danny Sampson, to say a few words about this term.
Oh, they're taking pictures. Wow, there's more of you than I knew. It's such a great turnout. It's really exciting to see this. I want to thank the St. Catharines Museum folks, Adrian and Kathy. You guys do great work all the time. It's really, really fabulous to work with you again. But these are the stars of my show tonight. These two have been such a pleasure to work with this term. They're great team players. They're thoughtful. They're energetic. They're hardworking. They've been amazing. Watching this presentation, it was really, really clear to me how hard it had been for them knitting together papers on the Ottoman Empire, on the Roman Empire, on Canadian anti-Chinese racism, and just the range of topics that they were dealing with, different time periods, different countries, reading these papers, trying to understand them, trying to understand their authors, trying to understand the quality of these papers, and the fine-tuning of the editing process that they took them all through. It was a really, really impressive thing. The technical dimensions of this show, where they had to learn the open access journal system. Did I get the acronym right? Something like that. It's open access and it's a journal, so that's all you really need to know. Which is quite a sophisticated program to work with. It's one of these things that they'll all tell you now, it's easy when you're done working with it after 4 months and learning the whole thing, but entry into that kind of thing is really opaque and difficult, and these guys handled it with aplomb. It was really wonderful to see. They gathered together a great bunch of writers. I read every one of these essays. I was thrilled reading them, thinking of our students doing this great work, our students putting this together in this impressive fashion. Where's the artist? There's the artist. Our students putting together this beautiful cover. It really was like a collective endeavor of hardworking people, bright people, doing amazing work, and it was an honor and a privilege to work with these two, and by extension, with the rest of you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sampson, for your kind words. This year's edition of the General is available in print for the authors and peer reviewers, and we will momentarily be publishing it online. So I'm going to do that right now. And it's officially published, so that's super duper exciting.
So that concludes the event now that it's published and we've talked about these phenomenal essays. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending this event and celebrating all those involved in this year's edition. We hope that you will consider reading the journal, which you can access online. And thank you again to the St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canal Center for hosting this very special event. You're all welcome to stick around and chat for a bit with us if you'd like, but thank you so much.